Hello and welcome to our webcast. I'm Danielle Johns with Moss Adams, and I'm going to get us started for today's session, Achieve Your Goals with an Organizational Assessment. We're pleased that you've joined us today. And before we begin, I'm going to play our housekeeping video.
Welcome, and thanks for joining. We're pleased to present our continuing professional education webcast series. Before we begin, please keep the following in mind. You can customize how you view our presentation and interact with the presenter. For better viewing, close all other applications and turn up your speaker volume. You can adjust window size and placement or enter full screen mode using the controls at the top right of the window or dragging the bottom right-hand corner to resize. At the bottom of your screen, you'll see a series of icons that relate to a different aspect of our session. You can download a PDF of today's slides from the Slide Deck and Handouts widget. You can ask questions by typing in the Q&A window and clicking Submit. We'll do our best to answer all questions or follow up via email. If you experience technical difficulty, refresh your browser by hitting the F5 key. Today's session offers 1 CPE credit. To receive credit, you must meet the National Association of State Boards of Accountancy requirements. You must attend at least 50 minutes of the session and respond to at least 75% of polling questions. To participate in the polls, please check the button next to your answer within the slide window and click Submit. We'll track your progress and alert you when you've earned CPE credit. You can then click the certificate icon in the CPE Progress widget and download your CPE certificate. Don't worry if you can't download your CPE certificate today. We'll email you a copy in 2 weeks. If attending this webcast in a group, you must complete our group CPE attendance sheet, available in our Slide Deck and Handouts widget to receive credit. Please have all group members sign it and send only 1 sheet per group. CPE credit can only be awarded to participants registered as themselves and isn't available for participants who view the on-demand version. This presentation is not legal, investment, or accounting advice. We encourage you to seek the counsel of a professional service provider to apply this content to your specific circumstances.
We have a couple of great speakers with us today from Moss Adams who will be introducing themselves momentarily. Their bios and contact information are located in your webcast console for your convenience. And now I'd like to turn the floor over to Annie Rose.
Thanks so much, Danielle. Hello, thank you all for joining us today. I'm Annie Rose Favreau, and I'm a consultant with our strategy and operations group. And I specialize in organizational development, strategic planning, governance, and board effectiveness initiatives, mostly for mission-driven organizations in the nonprofit and public sector space. So I'm really looking forward to sharing a little bit more about the organizational assessment process and how this type of assessment can help your organization get where you want to go. Tammy, over to you.
Great, thanks Annie Rose, and thank you everyone for joining us today. My name is Tammy Lohr, and I'm also a senior manager in our strategy and operations group. While Annie Rose helps clients quite a bit with a lot of that planning and strategy development, I really end up focusing on the operationalization of those goals. And we work together quite a bit on performing organizational assessments for clients that look at their people, processes, and systems and how each of those elements are working together to help achieve organizational goals. We're really excited that you're joining us today to learn more about this. So today we'll be going over what an organizational assessment is, some of the common things that trigger this type of assessment, as well as what is involved in doing this type of work. So really going over the methodology that is used to be able to deliver a thoughtful and impactful assessment. We'll also describe some of the benefits of an organizational assessment and go through some real-world examples of how organizations that we have worked with have been better able to achieve their goals after these projects are done. And with that, we have our very first polling question. So before we get started today, we wanted to learn a little bit more about who is on the webcast and what you might already know about an organizational assessment. So have you been through this type of work? Have you maybe heard about this type of work? Or is this really a brand new topic for you? And while you are filling out this polling question, I wanted to dispel the most common myth about an organizational assessment, which is that we are the Bobs from Office Space or George Clooney from Up in the Air. And that is absolutely not the intent of an organizational assessment. It doesn't just mean that you're looking to increase efficiency, aka eliminate staffing. It's really thinking about how you're able to use all of the resources available to you in the most strategic and impactful way possible. This is probably one of the most common misconceptions that we run into at clients. And then sometimes people might be afraid to talk to us. And then we have to sort of explain the purpose of this type of assessment, and that in fact, we are not the Bobs, we will not take your stapler, and that isn't the intention behind these engagements. All right, so it looks like about just over 10% of you have been through this type of assessment. About half of you are familiar, and then this is a brand new topic for some of you. So thank you for joining today. We're excited that you're here.
All right. Well, the next thing I wanted to talk about is really for the folks who are less familiar with this process, which is what is an organizational assessment? How do we define this? Because basically any team that you work with is going to have a slightly different approach, whether you're doing this work in-house or through a third party. So we wanted to share a little bit more about how our team at least conceptualizes an org assessment. And that the core definition is that an organizational assessment analyzes your people, processes, and systems to identify ways to improve your efficiency and effectiveness. So the goal of an organizational assessment is really to help you kind of move from point A to point B in terms of improving how your organization functions. And there's lots of different reasons that we'll talk about in terms of why somebody might choose to do an organizational assessment, or the sort of the appropriate moment to do this type of work. And we won't go through a couple of those, but I would say for me, really the first and foremost, the most critical one is assessing the factors that might be getting in the way or helping to support organizational functioning. A lot of times what happens is you might know that there are some type of challenges going on within your organization. You might be experiencing the symptoms of an underlying issue, but you might not know exactly what is going on. Or you might want to be able to validate. You say, I think this might be what is happening here, but is this really what our challenge is as an organization? And so that is a really fantastic time to do this type of assessment. So for example, we had a client where they consistently got feedback that communication was their number one issue. But when we dug into it, we realized that communication was basically this umbrella concept that was being used to really get at many different underlying factors, some of which did have to do with the literal process of like, how are we getting information out across the organization? But a lot of which really didn't have anything to do with formal communication and had a lot more to do with kind of lack of trust in leadership that was being expressed as a communication issue, which obviously you're going to tackle a lack of trust differently than if it were just a straight up communication challenge. So that type of sort of digging in and really understanding what are the root causes that are helping or hindering our organization in terms of our operations, that can be really for me, one of the most critical things that an organizational assessment can help you do. Now, having said that, some of the clients that I work with really see this type of assessment as a means of continuing to improve year after year. Maybe things are going really well and you're trying to understand, okay, we've kind of got locked in on our current operations, but we want to take it to the next level. What could we do to improve? That is a fantastic reason to do this type of work. Thinking about how the organization operates as a whole is another really fantastic benefit of this type of assessment. A lot of assessments are quite narrow and targeted, and most organizational assessments really do address the full enterprise, everything across the organization when we're thinking about your strengths and weaknesses and opportunities. And this can be really helpful for a couple different reasons. First of all, for example, if you have new leadership in place, this can be kind of a great moment to have that holistic view, to introduce a new leadership team to Where are we doing really well? Where are there challenges? Another piece of that can be sometimes you have certain departments that, due to the nature of their work, they take up a lot of space and time and energy, and that can make a lot of sense if they're really kind of the flagship, providing flagship services, something like that. But it can also mean that some of your other departments, often especially your internal services departments like HR or IT, sometimes they can get overlooked in these processes. So an organizational assessment that is really broad can help ensure that we're really looking at all areas within the organization. Now that I have expounded on the benefits of looking across everything, I will say we also sometimes do organizations that do focus on just a particular service line or program to really dig in and understand how can we optimize this particular area of work. So these are just some of the reasons why folks choose to do an organizational assessment. And now that we've gone through that, Tammy, do you want to talk about what is typically covered in this type of assessment?
Absolutely. Thanks, Annie Rose. So in general, when we are conducting an organizational assessment, we are looking at your operations. And ultimately, your operations are comprised of those people, process, and system components. These are obviously very broad categories that we'll break down in just a moment, but really these are the elements that can help or hurt your ability to achieve your goals. So if one of these is not working effectively, then the other two end up suffering. So for example, if you have great personnel, but your systems haven't been updated since 1992, then your team is probably spending a lot of time processing transactions because of that limited system functionality and integration. Conversely, if you have a fancy new system, but you have not updated your processes to fit that system, or gone through the process of appropriately managing change or training on your team, then you probably aren't realizing the full potential of the system. So while we'll talk about these three components separately in today's presentation, we do want to emphasize that really these three components are very closely related. They impact one another, and they should be all working together to help propel your organization forward. So let's dive into the people component of an organizational assessment. There are a number of people-related factors that we evaluate in this type of work because your employees really are your number one asset, and they have significant influence on whether you're able to achieve your goals. Some of the areas that we commonly look at are listed here on the slide, although again, as Annie Rose had mentioned, these can really be tailored depending on what exactly is going on in your organization. So we might see recruitment, retention, performance management, or even communication as standalone items in some cases. But in general, these are some of the key areas that we want to be sure to take a look at. So first we have employee engagement, which impacts employee well-being, the productivity, and their retention. Engaged employees tend to be motivated, focused, and committed to achieving the organizational goals. So essentially they care. And they also contribute positively to workplace culture, which is another area that we commonly evaluate. Regardless of whether you have asked us to look at your organization's culture or not, by the end of this assessment, we will be able to describe your culture just from working with you and your teams and doing this type of analysis. And in our experience, the saying that culture eats strategy for breakfast really does ring true. So in these assessments, we look at how your organizational culture impacts your operations. We work with you to identify those hidden rules and norms that underlie how you're achieving work and help you to start unpacking those areas and making intentional changes where they're needed. So for example, we worked with a library a few years ago that had a lot of cultural challenges, especially between management and staff. And it had a significant impact on their ability to effectively come together to serve their community. There was so much of this emphasis and focus on an us versus them mentality within their operations that service delivery to residents had really dropped in priority. So our independent third-party assessment really helped them realize that and develop effective strategies to work together and create shared goals in order to benefit their community and make sure that the community was the focus of everyone working in that organization. So then moving from these sort of abstract concepts of engagement and culture into these more tangible elements, we also look at staffing, which includes roles, responsibilities, staffing levels, and organizational structure. So here we're looking to see how resources align with your strategy and your goals, how teams are organized functionally to be able to accomplish work. We sometimes find that over time, organizations have moved positions and functions around, sometimes due to personal differences between individuals that are filling those positions and have since left the organization. And so we'll run into some interesting structures that also might be hindering how teams are able to collaborate and work together to pursue these different goal areas. So this organizational assessment is really a great opportunity to just revisit your structure and also see how it compares to other similar organizations and industry best practices. And then finally, some of the last two elements that we often look at are leadership and governance. So looking at the roles and responsibilities between your board and your executive leadership to see what the tone at the top looks like, how that influences your culture and your employees, and how effectively everyone is able to operate to pursue the organization's mission in a unified manner. Governance is something that Annie Rose works on a lot. It can end up being a really big area of focus if you have board members who maybe don't understand your organization or its particular constraints, or maybe they want to be too in the weeds on operations, and then that can slow everything else down and contribute to a reactive culture. So these relationships between executive leadership and the board are really important to keep the organization focused on its goals and moving toward them. The next big thematic area that we look at in these assessments is process. So the day-to-day processes that are really boots on the ground and how you actually do things. So here we're interested in things like planning and reporting. How are you actually going about planning your operations? And then monitoring and reporting out on progress to show how we are or are not achieving our goals. We also like to look at policies and procedures, which are really important and sometimes overlooked by organizations because, let's be honest, a lot of people don't think that policies and procedures are very fun to develop. I know that Annie Rose and I feel very differently about that. And so they can be that priority that sort of drops off as additional pressing matters come up. But these policies and procedures, they help to provide business continuity. So if you're to lose an employee, they help create clear expectations on who does what and how to complete a process. And they can be really helpful guides to new employees. These are really important, and we want to be able to see what's in place and how your work practices and employee expectations are or are not documented and available to your team members. So if, or sometimes when, policies and procedures are not comprehensively available, we also look at workflows to try and identify where the organization is using manual processes, where there are potential bottlenecks or rework happening, and also look for ways to increase the efficiency of these processes. A lot of times people have been doing the same work for a number of years and they're busy and they're just going through those sort of general motions of completing each activity on a routine basis. And so they just haven't had a chance to stop and even consider how that process could change. So again, an organizational assessment can be a really great time to uncover some process efficiencies, reduce transactional work, and help free up your employees to do more strategic and mission-critical activities. And then finally, with processes, we also look at roles and responsibilities. Are those even defined? It's sometimes unclear where one person's job ends and another's begins, and that can break down culture and collaboration among your teams. I'm actually working on a project right now where they have hybrid financial processes, and who does what and who is accountable for what are really unclear. And that ends up creating a lot of tension between a customer-facing department and their finance department. And it unfortunately came to a head in a public meeting earlier this year. So now they have brought us in to try to dissect that situation and provide recommendations to help everyone be able to move forward and work together better in the future. So again, these processes are another really important area to take a look at, making sure that they have these defined roles and responsibilities, especially if your organization is making updates or changes to your processes. The final area that we look at in organizational assessment is systems. So of course, a big one here is seeing how your IT systems are or are not working for you so that you can do your work efficiently and effectively. And when we think about systems, we think about everything from hardware, software, tools, those types of things, but we also think about the internal services that help support your organization's work. So areas like HR, IT, finance, and legal. If there are interruptions in those areas, or if they have a high workload relative to some of the other pieces of your or areas of your organization, it can slow down your productivity, which then impacts how you're able to pursue your goals. So I can probably count on one hand how many organizations think that their procurement process is fast enough, or that their HR department hires positions fast enough. And so those are some of the common themes that we sometimes hear about in these types of assessments. And often it's because those departments have not been staffed up as other program areas have increased. So really thinking through how your internal service systems are built in order to support your operations and the right size for those is a really critical element of at least an organizational-wide assessment. So then in turning to your technology systems, here we're trying to see how well things are working, what's automated, what's integrated, and what reporting functionality looks like, as well as thinking through how people are actually using your system capabilities. Sometimes we find that a system was put into place and there was so much going on during implementation that some of the functions that exist within that system are just not being used. And they're still being done manually, which can cost staff time and resources. So ultimately, your technology systems are really important to help support your processes and your people, and therefore your organizational goals. I will turn it back over to Annie Rose.
Great, thank you. Well, now that Tammy has walked us through the process, I wanted to close out this section just by highlighting the fact, sort of how do organizational assessments fit in with a changing environment? Because I highlighted before some of the reasons why folks have sort of historically chosen to conduct an assessment. But one of the things that we've been seeing in the past few years is, especially in response to all the changes instigated by the pandemic, we're seeing a lot of organizations dealing with new issues, and an organizational assessment can be particularly useful when you are trying to tackle something new or trying to sort of help set yourself up for future growth. So I wanted to go through just a few of those before we do another polling question here. And I would say the first one that is really come up quite a bit in the work that I do is organizations seeing a shift in their strategies or priorities, especially in the past few years. A lot of the organizations I work with have had to change something pretty major about their strategy or the services that they provide. And so they're asking that question, are we set up well in terms of our people, processes, and systems? Are we set up well in order to accomplish the new strategic goals that we have set for ourselves or the new services that we're providing? Employee morale is also a really big one. And some of this is coming from just new expectations that employees may have about their work, especially as new folks are coming into the workforce, or just very burnt out staff. There's a lot of employee teams right now that have been working really hard over the past couple of years and are very, very tired. And so seeing the employee morale becoming a much more critical area of focus as we're thinking about employee retention. For a lot of organizations where they really haven't had issues in this area, a lot are now facing some challenges here. So this also is coming up to answer the question, how can we better retain our employees? What can we do to shift how our organization is functioning so that we know that we're a really, really excellent place to work? Change often brings about some internal strife or dysfunction. I wouldn't say this is necessarily a new one, but for some organizations that maybe it's been super, super stable for a long time and suddenly you're having to deal with dysfunction, maybe you don't have the internal muscle built up to really deal with that yet. And an organizational assessment can make sure everybody's kind of on the same page around what are those challenges so that you can start thinking about how, as a team, are we going to approach some of the issues that have come forward. Talked a little bit about continuous improvement before. Outdated staffing models, especially if you've shifted your services or your service delivery process, your staffing model might just not make sense anymore. This can also be true if you've had elevated staff turnover, if you've had lots of folks leaving the organization, coming into the organization. That's a really excellent time. It obviously can create a lot of turmoil if you have people who are leaving, but it is also truly an opportunity for change because it gives you that chance to say, okay, if we have an open position that doesn't have a particular individual associated with it, how might we be able to reshape that position? How might we be able to use that resource differently, which can be a really helpful conversation to have. Your community might also be asking different questions from your organization than they did 3 or 4 years ago. We've already talked about some changes that we've seen in some of the clients we've worked with, but you might be in a position to say, okay, we actually need to change how we're doing some of our business as an organization in order to meet community needs. And then finally here, antiquated processes. Love an antiquated process, but it's super, super common, especially if your organization has been kind of in survival mode for the past couple of years, putting out a lot of fires. You might not have had the time to actually take a step back, as Tammy was talking about, and look at some of the processes that you have in place. And now, kind of as you're getting your head above water, now is a really fantastic time to think about optimizing. So again, these are just some of the more recent triggers that we have been seeing. You might recognize some of these here yourself. So before we move on to the next section, I'm going to do a very quick polling question here that is really just, we want to learn a little bit more about this group and understand where some of your biggest challenges might be. We've put a few of the most common challenges that we see up on this slide. So you might be having issues evolving your strategies and priorities, selecting where do we want to go next? What are our goals? That employee turnover and morale issue that I was speaking to before, maintaining adequate staff, that's a big one, and potentially community or stakeholder concerns as well. And finally, process inefficiencies. So I'm curious to see how this will play out. We'll give you about a minute here. It looks like about half of you have taken the poll so far. But I would say that personally, I'm seeing maintaining adequate staffing as probably the biggest challenge a lot of my clients are struggling with right now. Tammy, what are you seeing in your world as well?
Yeah, I think that it is a lot about staffing, although I think that has luckily started to decrease a little bit towards the end of this calendar year. And so seeing instead sort of more community and stakeholder concerns and really evolving concerns coming out of the pandemic and thinking about the future for organizations and realizing where priorities might have shifted over the last several years as an emerging area as well.
Yeah, absolutely. I think we're seeing a lot of change around really in all of these areas, obviously as they are interrelated with each other as well. And I know that we're going to leave, I think, the poll up maybe for a few more seconds to make sure that everyone gets an opportunity to answer the question before we move on. But I do imagine, oh great, here we go. Oh, interesting. So we have a pretty spaced out distribution here. We have a good chunk of you in evolving strategies and priorities and the employee turnover and morale. Interestingly, so yes, and maybe this speaks to Tammy, what you were saying about sort of the shift away from adequate staffing. About 17% of you are there. Community and stakeholder concerns lower, but a big chunk of you in that process inefficiency. And I would say that is super common, again, sort of, especially if you've been going through some change in the last couple of years. Processes are often kind of the last piece to get updated, to kind of come with the new way of working together. So not surprised to see that, but great to see that there's some variety here as well. Okay, so then I'm going to move us forward and talk about the typical assessment process. Tammy, you want to take it from here?
Yeah, yep, absolutely. So what we'll go through today is just the process that our team uses. There might be other processes that are in place that you might be able to accommodate internally or that other service providers may offer, but we wanted to just share sort of our methodology here. So to start out, we work with our clients to develop a project plan that really lays out our fact-finding activities, the analysis inputs, the key deliverables, and the desired communication cadence. We pretty quickly move into our fact-finding phase where we really get to dig in and learn about your organization. So we look at things like strategic and operating plans, again, my favorite topic, policies and procedures, relevant reports, data, turnover levels, things like that. Anything that's really relevant to get a good understanding of the environment that you're currently operating in. We also want to talk to your employees, and we want to get to know their perspective on the organization, including what is working well and what could be improved upon. So we work really closely with management to identify who to talk to. And because we usually can't talk to everyone, we will often do an online survey to gather more information from a broader group of employees or stakeholders. In some cases, we'll also engage community groups or members depending on the function that we're assessing. So for example, we performed an assessment of a city's permitting function earlier this year, and we ended up doing focus groups with some of the key developers in the community. We met with the Home Builders Association, and we also distributed a survey of everyone who had submitted a permit application in the last 3 years to be able to get their feedback on their processes. Similarly, if we're doing, an HR assessment or a finance assessment, then we also like to reach out to managers across the organization to see how that function is helping to be able to support their needs. So really getting that sort of customer focus and lens incorporated into this assessment. Once we have all the information that we need, we enter our analysis stage. So that's where we document your current processes and perform a gap analysis in relation to industry, peer, and best practices. During that time, we help to facilitate work sessions in order to share the results of this analysis out to leadership, and we start to develop recommendations to help close any gaps that were identified. Because we want these assessments to be really meaningful and useful to the organization, we want to make sure that we're testing the practicality and the feasibility of these recommendations with leadership to confirm that they make sense for your organization. We, through our processes, might find what a different community college system is doing to address a particular concern and come to you and say, here's an idea. And you could say, that doesn't make sense for us. And so we work with you in order to really understand, again, how it fits into your culture, to your strategy, to your goals, and to your resources. So we think about all those different pieces as we develop those recommendations with you. The last stage of this is moving into our reporting process, and that's where we'll prepare our draft and final reports, make sure that we review those with you, and then work with you to help develop an implementation plan for those recommendations. And those implementation plans are really helpful to help organizations prioritize the recommendations, identify the resources that are required to complete each initiative, and also provide a mechanism to manage and track progress on those areas. Sometimes at the end of this, clients will ask us to stick around and help with the implementation component of this assessment. So maybe helping with things like policy and procedure development, because we find that to be very exciting. We've also delivered employee and board member training, and we've facilitated workshops to help with difficult topics like culture, communication, and change with the relevant stakeholder groups as well. So as you can probably tell from that explanation of how these assessments are completed, there are a number of inputs that go into this analysis. And at the center of all of these inputs are your organizational goals. What are you trying to achieve? How are you going to get there? So we want to look at all this relevant organizational information like forecasts, documents, and data to get a really good understanding of where you're at right now in relation to where it is that you want to go. We also want to consider community and stakeholder information and input from employees across multiple levels and teams within your organization. And all of these inputs are absolutely critical to making sure that our analysis is complete and also really reflective of your current state. So a lot of our clients want to know, what are you going to compare us against? And we have a number of different options here. So in general, we will compare you against industry best practices that are specific to your organization type, whether that's a city, a county, a not-for-profit, a foundation, a school district, or an institution of higher education. Our team has team members that work pretty exclusively with these organization types. And so we have a lot of experience and exposure to different ways that others within your industry have navigated similar challenges, including what has and has not worked for them and any lessons learned. So this is just really an added benefit that we're able to provide our clients given our areas of focus. We'll also compare you to overall best management practices for things like communication, conflict resolution, planning and performance measures and processes. There are just overarching best practices in terms of how an organization should be working together. And so we have all of that available at our fingertips thanks to doing this work. And then finally, we will often do peer benchmarking, and that can help provide quantitative comparisons to organizations that are similar to you. This is something that is very popular, especially among board members that want to see, okay, well, what is this organization doing? And what about that university? How are they managing this? So to help select peers, we first work with leadership at the client to identify what are the most important factors in a comparable agency. Is it FTE count? Is it square miles served? Is it student population, geography, or some combination of those factors? And based on whatever that criteria is, we then begin to compile a list of possible benchmarking organizations, some of which are relatable peers, sort of an apples to apples comparison, and then some of which may be very aspirational peers that might have some quality that you're hoping to cultivate as you work to achieve these new goals. So we'll work with our clients to help whittle down this larger list to about 3 to 5 potential peers, and then start doing outreach to them so that we can collect relevant data, metrics, and information on how they're all navigating these similar situations or challenges. We then summarize this information into a matrix. It's put in the report, it's incorporated into the recommendations, and then we like to send that matrix summary back to those who participated in the work so that we can increase participation. We also give them something that could be a useful tool for their organizations as well. But in general, our goal is to compare you to what you need in order to achieve your goals. So even if, again, another university is doing something differently than how you're doing it, it might not always be the right solution to you. All of our recommendations are really based on our expertise and our deep understanding of your specific organization.
Right. So we also wanted to talk a little bit about implementation, because organizational assessments, they bring up a lot of ideas, and oftentimes you have at the end of this process a long list of recommendations for areas for improvement. And that can be sometimes pretty overwhelming if you're just dealing with all of the recommendations at once, especially if you're potentially stretched thin just with your day-to-day activities. So something that we really focus on in terms of implementation planning and support is making sure that when recommendations are delivered, that they're delivered in a prioritized order. And so we usually start thinking about this along the lines of urgency and importance. What is the urgency and importance of each of the recommendations or potential changes that we are recommending? And so I'm sure many of you are familiar with the Eisenhower matrix, where you kind of plot urgency along one axis and importance along the other. And where we really want to focus is on the recommendations that are highly urgent and highly important, or not necessarily urgent, but also highly important in the areas of work, because that's going to be, again, sort of aligning you with what are the most critical things for us to be doing today. None of this is a science, but we usually think about importance in terms of the potential positive impact on the organization. So we will start there to really say, okay, in the grand scheme of things, of all these recommendations, what is most critical, so that we can say these, if you only have resources to focus on a few, these are the recommendations that we think that you should start with. Obviously, sequencing is a logistics factor that needs to be taken into account if there are dependencies between the different projects, but that one's usually pretty straightforward. The other one on this list that is really a key consideration is resource availability. A lot of times the organizations we work with don't have the resources to do everything, or potentially even most of the recommendations that come forward. So it's even more critical that we hone in on what are those most vital items that need to be accomplished so that you can put resources behind them. The other thing is that we've seen a lot of organizations go through this assessment process. You get great results, you have every intention of implementing them, you've selected your key recommendations that you're going to move forward with, and then there's very little follow-up. So we want the organizational assessment to be as useful as possible, and action planning, implementation planning is part of that. We've included some of just the basic action planning best practices here. But I think for me, the most critical thing, well, I guess two things on this list. First is assigning that single person who's going to be responsible for moving the work forward. There's going to be a lot of other people involved in many of these processes, usually because this is organization-wide. A lot of the processes that we're looking at are also organization-wide, so therefore involving many different departments or stakeholders. But you still want that singular lead who at the end of the day is responsible for moving that work forward. That just helps a huge amount with accountability. And then I think the other piece is having regular, at least quarterly check-ins, whether that's with a senior leadership team, with your board, or even within an individual department. Having a regular time to come back to the assessment results and the recommendations that you're choosing to implement, so that this work doesn't get lost, because there's a lot of effort that goes into this type of work. We ask your staff to participate. We ask, we have people in interviews. We are using organizational resources to do this assessment. And in order to make it most effective for you, thinking about how are we actually going to implement that, and are we in a good position right now to implement that? Those are just very important pieces that we don't want to lose as part of the end of this process as well, because just once the assessment is done, that's kind of the beginning of the rest of the work too. So before we move on to our last section around case studies, we did want to do a quick knowledge check. So I'm opening up this polling question number 3. And it is this question of who should be involved in an organizational assessment. Board members, your management team, your employees, clients or other stakeholders, or all of the above. So I am curious to see, okay, it looks like we've got some responses coming in. We'll keep this open for about a minute here for folks. But hopefully this will be a quick knowledge check on the process itself. And I might be giving it away a bit here, but I would say very frequently we get questions around should we be involving our clients or our stakeholders. in this process. And Tammy, I'm curious to get your thoughts on that question.
I think it's really helpful if you do have a chance to be able to get your client or stakeholders' input throughout these types of assessments, because it makes it more impactful. So I gave that example earlier about doing an assessment for a permitting function, and we absolutely wanted to reach out to their clients, which are community members working on development, to make sure that we got an understanding of what the customer service looked like. And having that as a component was really impactful to help shape recommendations around guidance available to customers and communication practices to be able to help bridge that gap between those two parties and create really strong working relationships. So I think if you have the opportunity to do that, it's often worthwhile.
Yeah, absolutely agreed. I feel like that one can be, it kind of depends a little bit on sort of where you think you might have some challenges. If you know it's going to be in some of the service delivery areas, that one is absolutely one that shouldn't be missed. But I think across the board, it can be very helpful. And over 90% of you got this one correct, that it is all of the above. We really do want this to be a holistic process. So we're going to move on in our last little bit of time here. We did want to go through a few case studies, and I'm going to kick us off with a citywide organizational assessment. So the example here is that we were partnered with the city in 2019. We serve as the city's consultant of record. And in order to kick off our work with the city, we started with an enterprise-wide organizational assessment. And at the time, the city was facing some pretty significant challenges. They had a funding gap of over $10 million. They had already tried a type of priority-based budgeting to identify what they could stop doing, but it hadn't been super successful because it felt like all the services were really critical to the community. And so what was happening is that especially as there was turnover, as a colleague left a team, the people within that team would just take on and absorb their responsibilities and take on different functions. And this was becoming increasingly unsustainable for the employees and for each of the departments. And in addition to that, like many other local governments, the city was struggling with how to address issues related to homelessness and affordable housing, especially as this was becoming a stronger community priority, and the city was being asked to provide services that they really hadn't provided at all in the past. They were also experiencing some pretty significant changes in terms of their community composition, the demographics of their constituents, and they hadn't really revised their community engagement practices, so that they were kind of missing this. There was a gap where community members were not necessarily feeling engaged and connected. And last but not least, the city, like so many other cities, was dealing with a lot of outdated and aging infrastructure that really needed to be addressed, a significant amount of deferred maintenance, paired with that revenue shortage. So as you can tell, they had a lot of different potential challenges happening here, or current active challenges happening. And they wanted some help really to understand how can we become more fiscally sustainable, but also just more efficient and effective in our operations, and how do we prioritize within these many competing demands. So the organizational assessment was really designed to identify opportunities for improvement in the organizational structure and staffing, leadership and culture, communications, but also strong focus on operational performance. So for this work, in terms of our methodology, we started, as we typically do, with that document review. We were looking at all sorts of pieces of information, policies and procedures, after action reports, leadership assessments, plus everything to do with their budgets and their finances and their operating and strategic plans as well. So we really wanted to understand what is that sort of holistic environment that we have documented. But then we also needed to hear directly from people to create a SWOT analysis for their strengths, weaknesses, opportunities, and threats. So we did quite a few interviews. We administered an all-staff survey that was really designed to capture the staff perspective across the organization. We held a leadership retreat. We had focus groups. So we wanted to pair what we were seeing in the documents with the experience that staff members and members of the leadership team were having across the organization. Tammy, do you want to talk about solutions and outcomes?
Absolutely. We ended up having 4 really big themes that came out of this work. So the first was leadership and culture. So the city had been working to transform its leadership and adopt an enterprise management approach for quite some time. So historically, there had been a bit of operational siloing in between these departments, and really the city needed to come together and operate with a unified leadership team. So we assessed leadership and the impact of leadership practices on employees and productivity, and found that there really was this need to lead with a unified voice and message, prioritize consistently at that enterprise level, and also take accountability for actions. This organization had a culture of discussion and analysis, but very little action resulting from those conversations, and that was really impacting the city's ability to move forward. Our next area was organizational structure and staffing alignment. So in part because of this constrained revenue environment, the city's organizational structure had evolved very reactively to cuts in staff and programs. And that resulted in the deterioration of some natural collaboration between teams. Because these changes happened organically and were really reactive rather than strategic or proactive, there were also some critical areas that were understaffed, and that negatively impacted workloads and morale. So for example, there was less than half a person dedicated to working on homelessness, even though that was a community priority that Annie Rose had pointed out. And also development services was split between multiple departments, and they didn't usually see eye to eye on requirements. So even though these were areas that were community priorities that the city was very aware of, that they had been getting a lot of feedback about, the priority focus on these was not reflected within the organization structure or staffing levels. The next solution area is process streamlining. So again, due to those staff capacity constraints, processes and systems had not been looked at or consolidated, and there was very little IT governance. So the city was actually running and operating a number of duplicative systems across departments. An example of that is I think they had three or four different project management systems, depending on which department you were in. So there are some big opportunities here to enhance both the efficiency in terms of selecting these types of systems, creating unified processes, and also streamlining that IT support, as well as enhancing customer service. And then the last area was community reports. So the city had really been working on and improving its community communications and had some lessons learned about community outreach after they'd had a crisis in the prior year. But really there was an ongoing need to develop these really strong internal and external communication practices, which came back to the need to really unify leadership and break down silos across those departments. So what ended up happening with this organization was that the city developed a revised strategic plan that helped create unity and that sense of shared goals among its leadership team. We worked very closely with the city to help align their organizational structure and staffing with their goals and initiatives to make sure that those priority areas had adequate staffing. We also helped implement an IT governance framework to help streamline and prioritize those different system improvements that I mentioned. And then finally, we are currently working with the city to consider various revenue options to help support the general fund. And I will have Annie Rose talk about another example before we have our final polling question.
Great, thank you. I will keep this one short because I know we only have a few minutes left. But this was a small nonprofit in contrast to the last example. And as sort of the context of their work was that it was incredibly high workloads. People had a real high sense of urgency around the important work that they were doing. And they were really struggling with some financial processes to make sure that they were flowing smoothly. There was a lot of lack of clarity around why these financial processes were so challenging, but there was significant concern that this was impacting employee morale. So when you're in that high urgency setting, to have some of these really inefficient processes, there was big big concern there. So we came in and we did our typical document review, but really the employee interviews and focus groups were at the core of this. We spoke primarily to people in individual interviews because we wanted to understand their individual experience, sort of free from anybody else. We also, though, paired that with some process mapping. We looked at their policies and their systems as well to understand where there were really key bottlenecks in some of these key processes. And when we got into the solutions element, what we realized is that there were process and system issues for sure, but the leadership environment was really ultimately blocking forward progress. In particular, there was a key individual who was really standing in the way of this team being able to move forward. So we worked with the executive director to prioritize what needed to be done, and that really started with a change in performance expectations and coaching for that individual who's creating the challenge, but also for their leadership team in general. And then we made some recommendations to shifts in several key processes and help them identify they needed a long-term plan to update one of their most critical financial systems as well. And so some of the outcomes that particular individual did end up leaving the organization actually separate to this assessment. But with that one individual gone, it allowed the team to kind of recoalesce around some of these processes and really create a lot more stability within their finance team as they were streamlining some of these processes and improving that work for folks. So this was a pretty good success story, sort of beginning, middle, and end of figuring out and really identifying what the issue was, being able to provide a solution, and then actually help implement as well. So I'm going to move us to our very last polling question here to make sure everyone can get their CPE. But we are curious about where you think your organization could potentially benefit the most in terms of an assessment that focuses on something like leadership and governance, employee engagement and development, systems or process improvement, staffing and organizational structure, communication and collaboration, or everything. You might want the whole shebang in here in terms of looking across all areas of your work. So we will leave this open for a little bit longer here so that we can make sure everyone has time to get their last CPE polling question in. I would say that from this list, a lot of the organizations I'm working with recently have been in the everything bucket, where folks really want to say, you know, we might be in, again, that new operating environment, and we want to look at all the pieces. Tammy, what are some of the most common ones you're seeing?
Yeah, I think people do want that everything piece. There might be specific areas of focus around employee engagement or staffing and structure. But I think in general, if you're going to do this type of assessment, it's worthwhile to take a look at all of these different components while you have everyone's attention and you have an external party already in there trying to help and take a look at these pieces. They're so interrelated that sometimes it can be hard to parse them out from one another.
Yeah, absolutely. All right, well, we've got quite a few that have come through. Thank you so much. It looks like we've got a good chunk of folks in the systems and process section and a good chunk of folks in the everything section, which is great to see. Since we are running short on time, we are probably not going to have a chance to get to all of the questions that came in, but we will do follow-up for folks who we didn't get to answer the questions. Thank you so much for submitting those in the chat log. And with that, I think we can actually hand this back over to Danielle to close us out.
Thank you, Annie Rose and Tammy, for a great presentation today. To our audience, if you have any further questions or comments, please reach out to us as we'd be happy to continue the conversation. You can drop a note in the Q&A window or reach out to Annie Rose or Tammy directly. Their contact information is in your console and on the screen. If you met all CPE requirements, your certificate is available to download now in the CPE progress window. A copy will be emailed within 2 weeks if you have difficulty downloading it now. Finally, here's a link for today's survey for today's presentation. Your feedback is appreciated so we can make the most out of your time with us. Thank you again for joining us, and take care, everyone.